I want you to look at this stem. Go ahead and look at it. Not much to see, is there? No flower, no color, a few tired leaves and a piece of gray wood about the thickness of a pencil. Now watch my hand. Right here, 4 or 5 inches down from the tip, is where most of us would cut. The wood looks spent, the old flower has gone brown and papery, and any tidy gardener wants it gone before the leaves drop. On the wrong kind of hydrangea, that one cut, made right there, in September, takes away a flower you will not miss until next July. Not this year's flower, next year's. I am Curtis Loomis, and I am putting these pruners back in my pocket, because pruning is only one of 7 things that decide what this bush does next summer, and it is not even the sneakiest one. One of the other 6 looks exactly like good plant care, the kind of thing a good-hearted person does on a Saturday morning and feels fine about afterward. Another happens because the air turns cool one week and we all quietly decide the plant has stopped drinking. By the time either shows itself, it is June. The bush is green and healthy and bigger than ever, and there is not one flower on it. Nothing you do in June undoes a decision you made in September. But before you touch that plant, there is one question you have to answer. Get it wrong, and nearly every piece of hydrangea advice you have ever read becomes dangerous in your own yard. Here it is. Where does next summer live on this plant? Because a hydrangea does not keep next year's flowers in one standard place. Depending on which one you own, next summer sits at one of 3 addresses, and each address wants completely different care from you this month. Address 1. Next summer is already up here, on the wood standing in your yard right now. Those are the old wood bloomers. Your mop heads, the big round blue and pink ones. Your lace caps, with the flat lacy heads. Your oak leaves, with leaves shaped like a red oak leaf. I will use the Latin one time and then leave it alone. The mop heads and lace caps are Hydrangea macrophylla, big leaf hydrangea. The University of Georgia Extension says it sets its flower buds in late summer for the following year and tells Georgia gardeners not to prune it after the 1st of August. Minnesota Extension puts a range on it. Buds for next year form in August and September. August and September, which is right now. So on those plants, next July is already built, already on the stem, already out in the weather, just very small, wrapped in tight little scales, and most of us cannot tell them from an ordinary leaf bud at arm's length. Address 2. Next summer is not up here at all. It is down at the bottom, waiting. Those are the new wood bloomers. Panicle hydrangea, your limelight, and the other cone-shaped ones. Smooth hydrangea, your Annabelle and Incredible. Big round white heads on stems that flop after a hard rain. These build next year's flowers on stems that have not even grown yet. Minnesota Extension says the smooth ones can be cut low in spring once established, and the buds form on the new growth that follows. Same word on the tag at the garden center, hydrangea. Opposite relationship with a pair of pruners. Address 3. Both. The reblooming big leaves, the endless summer family, and others bred the same way. Flower on last year's wood and on this year's new growth. Minnesota Extension says they will bloom whether you prune them or not. That is a safety net the rest of us do not have. So here is your first job, and it is worth more than the other 6 put together. Go out this week and work out which address you are dealing with. The clues are in the flowers and the leaves. Big round heads or flat lacy heads on a broad glossy leaf. That is big leaf, old wood. Leaves shaped like an oak leaf, old wood. Cone-shaped or pointed heads, panicle, new wood. Big round white heads on thin floppy stems, smooth hydrangea, new wood. But I would rather you be safe than confident. Those are good clues. They are not a guarantee. There is real overlap between species and between cultivars. The rebloomers look just like ordinary mop heads, and a nursery tag is not always right about what is in the pot. So here is the rule I want you to carry, and it may be the safest sentence in this whole video. If you are not certain what you have, do not make a major September cut until you have identified it, and you can get certainty. Photograph the flower head, the leaf, and the whole shrub, and take it to your county extension office or a good independent nursery. Untidy costs you nothing. A guess can cost you a summer. Which brings us straight to the thing your hands are already itching to do. September is the month the garden starts looking like it needs somebody to take charge of it. Brown heads, stems leaning every which way, and everything about it saying, "Clean me up." And this is where the neatest gardeners on the street quietly punish themselves for being neat. Penn State Extension is blunt about it. Cut back a hydrangea between autumn and early spring, and if it blooms on old wood, you have trimmed off the future flowers. Not damage them, remove them. And here is the distinction that settles half the pruning arguments in America. A spent flower is not a dead stem. That brown, papery head did its work in July. But the stem holding it up is very much alive, and on an old wood hydrangea, that stem is the shelf next summer is sitting on. A dead flower is not a permission slip to keep cutting down the cane. So how do you tell a finished stem from a truly dead one? Do not go breaking canes to find out. Here is the gentler way, and the one I trust. Take your thumbnail or a pocket knife and scratch a tiny patch of bark, low on the stem, no bigger than a grain of rice. If what you uncover is green and moist underneath, that stem is alive, and it stays. If it is brown and dry all the way through, that is dead tissue, and you can take it out. You can flex a stem gently first, and anything that feels brittle is worth scratching. But the scratch tells you, not the snap. A cane you break to test is a cane you have already lost. So here is your whole pruning list for September, whichever address the plant lives at. Dead wood, broken stems, anything rubbing an open wound into a neighbor. Dead, damaged, diseased are in season every day of the year. Everything else stays, including all that brown flower. And if you own a panicle, Minnesota Extension suggests leaving those dried cones through the winter for the look of them and pruning in late winter instead. Hang the pruners on the nail. We will get them back out in late winter, and by then, you will know which plant you are allowed to swing at. Now, let me give you something to actually do. Something happens in the first cool week of September. The mornings go crisp, the big leaves stop wilting the way they did all July, and without ever deciding to, we quit watering. That is quiet trouble, because the plant stops complaining before it stops needing. The University of Georgia calls bigleaf hydrangea a water-demanding plant. Cool air changes how fast the leaves lose water. It tells you nothing about what is left down where the roots live. So do not stop watering because September feels cooler. And do not water by the calendar either. Go check the root zone. Watch me. Pull the mulch aside, about a foot out from the main stems, under the outer leaves where the working roots are. Then get down several inches into that root zone, 4 to 6 inches, with a trowel or a hand probe, and put your fingers in the soil. You are sorting it into 3 buckets: genuinely dry, evenly moist, or saturated. Genuinely dry feels dusty or hard, looks pale, and leaves loose grains on your fingers. That plant needs a slow, deep drink. Evenly moist feels cool and damp, darkens your fingertips, and holds together a little when you close your hand on it. That plant is fine. Check again in 5 to 7 days. Saturated is wet and slick, maybe a little sour smelling. If a plant is wilting in ground like that, the trouble is not thirst. It is roots that cannot get air, and more water is not kindness. Now, the Department of Agriculture has a formal version of this, the feel and appearance method, where you squeeze soil into a ball and press it into a ribbon. Good method, free to look up, but hear the honest part, because I have seen folks get bad advice from it. What that ball and ribbon mean depends entirely on your soil texture. Sandy soil will hardly ever ribbon even when there is plenty of moisture in it. Heavy clay ribbons beautifully when it is drier than you think. So read those charts against your own soil, and for most of us with one hydrangea, dry, evenly moist or saturated is the judgment that matters. Then act on it. When the root zone is genuinely dry, water deeply and less often. A slow trickle at the base, long enough to soak past the mulch into the root zone, then leave it several days. That beats 5 minutes with the hose every evening, which only wets the mulch and trains every root to stay near the surface, where the first dry week will find it. What you want is a root zone that stays reasonably, evenly moist and never sits saturated. How often that takes depends on your rainfall, your soil, your climate, and how established the plant is. A shrub planted last spring wants watching far closer than one that has stood there 15 years. And do not keep pushing any woody plant with heavy late-season watering when it ought to be settling down for winter. Steady is the word. Never soaked, never bone dry going into the cold. One more thing while my hands are down here. If your hydrangea has spotted leaves, and we are going to talk about those, water low at the base and early in the day. Wet leaves overnight are an open door. Now I owe you the one I promised at the top, the mistake that looks like kindness. Late in the season, a hydrangea starts to look tired. The blooms fade to something between pink and paper. The leaves lose that glossy June green. Growth slows and the plant stops showing off. And a caring person looks at that and thinks the same thought every time. It needs feeding. Set the bag down. What you are looking at is very often not hunger. It is a plant finishing its year on schedule. All summer that plant has been spending. Leaves, flowers, growth, the whole show. Somewhere in late summer the accounting flips, and it starts moving what it made, down into its stems and roots to hold over the winter. September is not the end of the season. September is the month a hydrangea stops spending and starts saving. And you do not help a savings month by handing the plant something that says, go spend. That is what nitrogen says. Nitrogen says, make leaves. The University of Georgia lists excess nitrogen among the reasons a big leaf hydrangea fails to flower, right alongside too much shade and pruning at the wrong time. Their own feeding months for that plant are March, May, and July, not September. Now, there is a version of this advice going around that is stretched further than the science will carry it. You have heard the flat rule. Never feed anything in the fall because it forces soft growth that cannot harden off. And Clemson Extension says plainly that for conifers and most hardwoods, that old worry is unfounded. So the internet rule is too broad. Except read Clemson's next point because it is the reason we are having this conversation at all. They name the exceptions. The plants that push more than one flush of growth in a season and genuinely can be stimulated by a late feeding. Azaleas, hollies, red and sugar maples, and hydrangeas. Of all the plants in your yard, this is one of the few where the caution is real. New Hampshire Extension advises against high nitrogen from late August into mid-September for that reason. So I will not tell you never feed a hydrangea in September anywhere in America. That is a slogan, not advice. Here is the honest version. Do not feed a hydrangea because it looks tired. Tired is what finishing looks like. If a soil test shows a real deficiency, that is a real reason, and it has nothing to do with how the plant looks. If the ground is dry, do not feed at all. And where hard freezes come, let the feeding wait for dormancy or spring. September is not the month I ask a hydrangea to impress me. It is the month I help it finish the year properly. Here is another job you can genuinely do. 10 minutes a plant. Good mulch steadies the moisture, softens the freeze and thaw swings that are harder on roots than plain cold, and feeds the soil as it breaks down. Everybody who watches Loomis has heard me say it. Feed the soil, not the plant. How deep? Penn State Extension says 2 to 4 inches on well-drained soil, and less where drainage is poor. It is a range, not a magic number, and if your ground stays wet, you stay at the low end. But depth is not the mistake I see from the road. This is. Watch what I am doing here. See how it is piled against the stems, right up around the crown where the canes leave the ground. Somebody stood here with a wheelbarrow and tucked this plant in like a child. That is a mulch volcano, and I want you to pull it apart. New Hampshire Extension says, keep mulch a couple of inches back from the base, and specifically says, do not build a volcano. Rutgers goes further for young shrubs, 3 to 5 inches of clearance. What you want is a wide, flat donut out toward the edge of the leaves with bare ground around the canes where you can see them come out of the soil. Why does that matter so much? 2 reasons. First, bark is built to be dry and in the air, and mulch held against it all winter keeps moisture on the one part of the plant that cannot take it. Second, and this is the one that gets missed, deep mulch piled against a woody stem is not a blanket, it is a house. Rutgers, in their fact sheet on over-mulching trees and shrubs, spells it out. Those piles are cover for mice and meadow voles. They live under the warm mulch all winter, out of sight of the hawks and the cats, and they chew the inner bark. New Hampshire says the same. Voles eat bark and can girdle a plant entirely. And here is the line from Rutgers I want you to carry with you. It often goes unnoticed until the following spring, when the plant does not look good. Do you hear what that is? That is the same crime as the pruning mistake. Same result, same timeline, same silence. Something removed the stem carrying next summer while you were not looking, and you found out in the spring. Only this time, it was not your pruners. It was a mouse living in the mulch you put there to help. But first, the leaves. Sometime this month, a lot of you have looked at your hydrangea and gotten a small fright. Brown spots, purple-rimmed blotches, lower leaves yellowing and dropping. And the thought is always the same. Something is killing it. What do I spray? Let me take that worry off you. Late-season leaf spot is common on hydrangea, mostly cosmetic on an established shrub, and it is not a plant dying. Those leaves were headed for the ground anyway, but there is a genuinely useful thing to do about it, and it is not in a bottle. Amanda Bratcher, a horticulture agent with North Carolina Cooperative Extension in Lee County, explains something most gardeners never hear. Many of the leaf diseases we see in the fall are the result of infections that happened back in the spring, then expanded as late summer rains splashed them from the older bottom leaves up into the new growth. What you are looking at in September started in April. The spots are the end of that story, not the beginning, which is why she is straightforward about what a fungicide does for you now. Not a whole lot. Those leaves will stay spotted until they fall. There is no paint for a damaged leaf. So here is what helps. Remove the infected leaves. The ones on the ground, and here is the part people miss. The ones still hanging in the bush that would otherwise stay there all winter. Do not put them in the home compost pile. Extension is specific. Remove and dispose, so the source of the spores is not sitting there waiting for spring. Then water low and early so the leaves have the day to dry, and give the plant some air instead of letting it be crowded against a wall. I will say it the way I think about it. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do for a plant in September is not something you put on it. It is something you carry away from underneath it. There is a bucket sitting under that hydrangea right now with next year's disease pressure in it. Take it to the curb, or leave it there, and wonder in June. Now the one I have been walking you toward all this time. Because after all that you might reasonably think, all right, Curtis, I will not cut it, I will not feed it, I will water it properly and fix the mulch. Surely now the flowers are safe. Not necessarily. And this is the thing I most want you to leave with today. A hydrangea can come through the winter perfectly alive and still lose every flower. The plant lives. It leafs out in April, green and healthy, fills out beautifully, and it does not bloom. And its owner spends the whole summer wondering what they did wrong. Penn State Extension lays out how that happens. On a big leaf hydrangea, the roots may be perfectly hardy, while the top of the plant is not. Cold can take the flower buds, or the stems, or both. Early freezes, late freezes, or simply a bitter winter can damage buds that formed the year before. Georgia says the same, in winter and in late spring both. So the plant survives from the roots, sends up a beautiful mound of leaves, and has nothing to bloom from. The little shelf next summer was sitting on is gone. Which means everything today is really one job wearing 7 different hats. Protect the wood that is carrying the flowers. Pruners take that wood. Voles under the mulch take that wood. A hard winter takes that wood. And there is a fourth mouth. Minnesota Extension recommends protecting big leaf hydrangea from winter rabbit browsing with a ring of hardware cloth about 4 feet tall. Think what that animal does out there in February. Standing in the snow, taking the tender tips off your stems. That is pruning. It is just not your hand on the tool. So what about the cold? Here I will refuse to give one national answer, because I would rather be useful than tidy. Do not wrap every hydrangea in America, because the calendar says September. Whether a plant needs protection depends on which address it lives at, your hardiness zone, how exposed the spot is, how hard your winters run, and how established the plant is. A hardy panicle like a limelight is generally not depending on overwintered flower buds for next year's bloom the way an old wood mophead is. That is the real difference, and it is a big one. It does not mean a panicle is beyond care. Cultivar hardiness, establishment, site, exposure, and moisture going into winter still matter for any shrub. It means the flowers are not the thing hanging in the balance. An old wood mophead in a cold zone out in open wind is a different conversation entirely. That same plant in a mild winter region may sail through on its own. If the cold does reach those buds where you garden, the methods are simple and peremphatically. Extension-backed. Georgia describes a cylinder of chicken wire set around the plant and filled with loose leaves as excellent cold protection, and an old sheet or a cardboard box for a night dew below freezing. Minnesota's hardware cloth ring does double duty against the rabbits. Leaves or straw inside a cage, never plastic wrapped tight to the stems. And the timing, which is why I saved this for last. September is when you decide, It is not when you wrap. You wrap once the plant is dormant, and the cold has settled in, not while it is still working in warm afternoons. September is for learning which plants are at risk, and for having the wire and the leaves ready, instead of standing out there in November with a bedsheet and a flashlight. Now let me hand you the thing I actually want you to keep. Nobody remembers 7 tips past Thursday. This is what I do when I walk up to one of these in September. And around here at Loomis we call it the September check. 7 questions, in order. 1. What kind of hydrangea is this? Roundheads, flatheads, cones, oak-shaped leaves. 2. Old wood or new wood? Where does next summer live on this plant? And if I am not certain, no major cut until I know. 3. Is the soil actually dry? Not is the air cool. Mulch back, fingers several inches into the root zone. Dry, evenly moist, or saturated. 4. Is that stem dead, or has it simply finished flowering? Scratch a little bark. Green underneath and it stays. 5. Are those leaves diseased, or just old? And either way, is there a bucket full under this plant that ought to go to the curb? 6. Is this mulch a donut or a volcano? Can I see bare ground where the canes come out of the soil, or is there a mouse hotel built against the bark? And 7. The one that has saved me the most trouble. Am I about to do this because the plant needs it, or because I want the garden to look tidy? That last one is not a scolding. It is just an honest thing to ask in the one month of the year when tidiness and flowers pull in opposite directions. 7 questions, 10 minutes a plant, and you never have to memorize a list again. You have a way of thinking instead. Now, remember this stem. Same one I showed you at the start. Still nothing to look at. Still no flower, still a little gray, still leaning where it should not. In September, it is easy to stand in front of a hydrangea and see a season ending. On some of them, that is exactly right, and next summer will be built fresh from the ground up when the weather turns. But on the mop heads and the lace caps and the oak leaves, on the old wood types standing in yards all over this country, this stem is not the end of anything. It is already carrying the beginning of next summer. That is why fall hydrangea care is not about forcing one more flush of green out of a tired plant. It is about protecting what the plant already built, quietly, in the last weeks of August, while none of us were watching. Because sometimes, next year's flowers are lost 6 months before you ever notice they are missing. Everything from today is in a free printable checklist you can carry out to the bench. Identification, the pruning decision tree, the scratch test, the moisture check, the mulch reset, and the winter risk list. The link is in the description. No charge, nothing to sign up for. If this was useful, subscribe and stay with Loomis. We are going to keep saying the same stubborn thing. Feed the soil, not the plant. Go easy on that bush this month.